Hey folks, I know I promised a next episode on Donald Trump, but spring got a little crazy with unforeseen events, and I forgot to publish this wonderful interview that I'm excited to share with you today. It is a new look back at an old president, perhaps more responsible than any other for the two-party system we live under today. So, get ready for a treat as I'm joined by journalist and historian James Bradley to discuss his new book, Martin Van Buren, America's First Politician. Welcome to the Abridged Presidential Histories with Kenny Ryan, Episode 8A, Martin Van Buren, America's First Politician, an interview with James Bradley. I'm excited to welcome James Bradley to the show today. James is the co-editor of the Martin Van Buren papers at Cumberland University and a longtime journalist and historian in New York. He is also the author of a new biography on our 8th president titled Martin Van Buren, America's First Politician. As we sit in this era of extreme partisanship, I thought it would be a good time to revisit the man who believed the right kind of partisanship could maybe be a good thing. So thank you for joining me, James.
Thank you, Kenny. Great to be with you.
It's been a while since we talked about Martin Van Buren on this podcast. So real quick, who was Martin Van Buren and what inspired your interest in him?
Well, he was many things. I mean, he had quite the resume. He was a great lawyer. He was a state senator. He was the state attorney general. He was the driving force behind the revamping of the New York State Constitution. He was the United States Senator from New York. He was Andrew Jackson's campaign manager in 1828, and then he became Andrew Jackson's, the nation's Secretary of State, and then the Minister to Great Britain. And then he was Vice President of the United States, and then President of the United States. Oh, and along the way, he was the principal founder of the Democratic Party, and probably the most formative, influential American to create what we now call the party system. And then he ran for president on a third party ticket in 1848. So when you look at the whole panorama of American history, of the early republic, you really find Martin Van Buren almost like a Zelig-like figure. He was kind of there playing a key role in shaping many key events of this whole period.
So he was a man of many, many, many hats.
Now, you could say, but they were all political.
They're all
not
political.
Like he also
right,
played
right.
the violin or anything like that at all. He was a politician through and through, but he had a lot of experience as an executive. He had a lot of experience as a legislator. He was even a judge. I didn't even mention that to you. He was briefly a judge on the Court of Errors, which was sort of like an appellate court in New York. But a lot of senators sat on. I mean, the whole system of politics in New York is so strange and so completely divorced from our current reality. It's almost hard to go through. But it was very common for politicians in New York in the early 19th century to hold many offices simultaneously. He was an attorney general and a state senator at the same time. And there are people, yeah, so you see this all the time. So he was very much part of that scene, which was, you want to be in politics, you have to have as broad a reach as possible. So he really embodied that in ways that would never fly today.
For sure.
All kinds of ethical, possible.
Yeah. Conflicted.
Which is not a high.
It's supposed to be separate branches of government. You're in both of them. What's going on? Yeah.
Right. So you saw a lot of that going on.
I have to say, the Court of Error sounds like the last court I'd ever want to appear before. I just assume it's a judge telling you everything you've done wrong lately. Like this mistake, that mistake, that mistake, 3 pence. That's your charge, you know. There's a line.
Pretty much how it went.
There's a line I heard a while back. The past is like a foreign country. They do things differently there.
Yeah, great line. The go-betweens, yep.
And that's especially true of American politics in Van Buren's day. 200 years ago, like who could vote was different, how people voted was different. So I'm curious, can you help me paint the complete picture? What were some of the biggest ways our democracy worked differently back then?
Okay, when you say back then, I have to pin you down for a little more detail because things changed rapidly from, say, I don't know, 1812 to 1832. That's when there was a period of rapid. But in 1812, in New York at least, there was still property requirements in place as to who could vote. Of course, it was still all male. Some blacks could vote if they met property requirements, but not that many did.
Mm.
And that was something that was taken away from black voters in 1821.
Mm.
But in Van Buren's time, especially after the War of 1812, when a lot of veterans returned from the conflict to see that their lives had drastically changed, that a lot of their landlords, who obviously were not collecting rent while they were away at battle, said, I
Mm.
think you owe me some money now. They couldn't
Mm.
eat it, they were injured. So throughout New York and New England and the Northeast, we started to see a lot of states changing their colonial era charters to eliminate a lot of those barriers for men to vote. And New York was no exception to that. And Van Buren was really one of the principal agents for expanding the franchise of voting. So that was one big change in just how the whole elective franchise took place. Other than that, I kind of alluded to a few things. There was really open season in terms of bribery and scandal. I
Yeah.
mean, people were voting for bank charters in which they had a financial stake in. I mean, there was really no sort of system of oversight in
And
this
there's no
area.
secret ballot yet, right? Like when you go to vote, it's all very open who you're voting for.
Yeah,
Am I remembering that right?
yeah. I mean, yeah, they had the viva voce method was still very much in place, but then eventually they started moving toward the paper ballots where you could drop it in the box. Uh, how up all of these elections were. You know, you hear a lot of anecdotes about people voting early and voting often. I'm sure that took place. So it was a very informal system. You know, there's a great painting called The County Election, 1850. What was his name again? Bingham, the Missouri artist, who's got this great painting of a scene of Election Day in 1850. And you
Yeah.
see there are people who are drunk. I mean, they're being carried up the steps to vote. And you see a man in the corner, he's got a bandage around his head because he's just been in a fight. You can just see they're serving booze. People have just been in fights. People
Mhm.
are drunk. I mean, it's a real rowdy scene. And there's open canvassing taking place. You know, this is the sort of scene that would have horrified the founding fathers. This is
Mm.
where they envisioned this world of responsible gentlemen who had a stake in society, who
Yeah.
were lawyers and merchants and
Right.
professionals who owned land. So they had a real stake in who won the election, who represented them in Congress. The idea that common folk could go out there and have just as much a say in any of this as they did in the early years of their republic was completely anathema to them, really offensive on many levels.
Hmm.
So this sort of big sea change in how political campaigning and political elections took place
Yeah.
was something that Martin Van Buren in many ways represented.
Yeah. So it's a major period of change, which is opportunity, and he's one who seizes on it. And into this world he comes, and you call him America's first politician. Why?
He was, in my opinion, the first professional politician in the sense that he saw politics as a livelihood, as a profession that should be staffed by experts, by people who understood the political process, how to cement loyalties with voters. They mostly used patronage to achieve this. To, in order to give in order for democracy to be more than just an idea, but a
Mm.
real entrenched presence in American life, there needs to be something to hold that all together. And for Van Buren and many of his allies, but I think Van Buren was the most tireless and dogged advocate for this, that there had to be a political party, an organization with a structure, with an organization and with a means to connect with voters through newspapers, through campaigns, uh, just learning how to keep citizens involved in the political process. Again, through the distribution of patronage. All of this was a way of making sure that this patrician world of 18th century federalism that he grew up in and he intensely disliked, that he rebelled against, that it was something that would never see its way in American politics ever again. That was really one of the great callings of his life, to just see that world in which he grew up in upstate New York, the land of this world of the landed gentry, where he had these powerful families who owned land and made sure no one could vote because they didn't own land, all their tenants. They wielded enormous power in the legislature. They had a disproportionate role in American life. So he just saw vast inequality, and that was something he didn't want to see replicated on the national scale.
So he sees political parties as a way to confront that, as a way to build something powerful enough.
Yeah, it was not just a way of winning elections. Of course, that was a big part. Of course, he wanted to win. Of course, he wanted to be in office, and he wanted his people in office. But he also saw this as a way of establishing democracy's long-term success. He said, parties are inseparable from free governments. He really saw the two hand in hand. Now, there's no mention of political parties in the Constitution.
Right.
And of course, in the 1790s and earlier, in the time of the Federalist Papers, you heard all this talk about factions and how destructive they were. That when you get people behind a faction, they care more about the faction's success and not the long-term success of the country. So you could see where they were coming from, of course, that these sorts of associations can have an insular quality about them. And Van Buren conceded all of this. He never said parties are perfect. But he just said when they're run well, and that was always something essential to him. He just said when there is vigilance, they can give people a heightened voice in government, they can expose corruption, and they can make sure that people of disproportionate power cannot exert their influence on political life. The best way to ensure this was to have a party that people were connected to.
And I'm curious, because he kind of grew up in an age where you had this hyper-partisanship. As you said, the 1790s, you had the Federalists versus Jeffersonian Republicans, which basically battled each other like to the political death. And then you get the era of good feelings, which is when he's really coming in, where the Federalists are increasingly defeated, gone. And when he looked at that, how did that inform him to see a period of two parties really going at it, to an era of one party, which was almost an era of no parties?
Well, a few things to be said there. First of all, in the first party system, no one really saw political parties as a permanent presence in American life. The idea was, okay, we need to all band together to fight the first bank of the United States.
Sure.
Okay, we all need to get together to try to advocate on behalf of France and America. There was all kinds of reasons why people thought there was going to be a coalescing of interests. But the idea was, once that issue is settled, we all go our separate ways. And the idea was, once the nation, because we have to remember this, you talk about the past being a foreign place.
Right.
America was a brand new nation, brand new. No one was sure how this whole experiment in self-rule was going to work out. Because there was this period of uncertainty there was this belief that once we get these big issues settled, this whole Bill of Rights, what kind of role is the government going to play in manufacturers? What kind of role is the government going to play in tariffs and whatever the issue could have been? The idea was once we become more secure as a nation and get this all settled, then we won't need parties anymore. We really won't. But for now, next time we'll take care of it. But for now, let's just I have not heard anyone who think they were going to be the parties were going to have a permanent role in America.
Right.
So by the late 1810s, as you say, this was James Monroe becomes president. He is the 5th president of the United States. And in 1820, he runs unopposed. He gets every electoral vote except one.
That one guy.
William Plumer from New Hampshire, who didn't like Monroe. He liked John Quincy Adams. So he gave his one electoral vote to John Quincy Adams. And John Quincy Adams, by the way, was mortified Like, I can't believe it. This schmuck gave me a vote. I didn't ask for it. Nevertheless. Uh, so Van Buren sees a
Yeah.
recipe for chaos here.
Yeah.
He conquers New York,
Yeah.
goes to Washington, and he is determined that the success he finds in New York, he's going to bring that to Washington
Yeah.
because he thinks this whole era of good feelings, no party, we're all above partisanship now. This is just a way to facilitate federalism's rebirth. And he sees James Monroe, who was really one of the few politicians he didn't like. He had mostly good things to say about everybody, Van Buren.
Yeah.
Even his critics had good things to say about him. But Monroe is someone you can see he really didn't care for. And he thought he was weak and ineffectual. And he wanted to see a real partisan firebrand in the White House. Instead, we see Monroe, who's much more conciliatory, and he, in his second inaugural address, talks about we are rising above the party spirit. We are creating the most perfect institutions ever devised. And again, Van Buren says, well, he's giving us all this lofty rhetoric about how we don't have parties anymore. The Federalists are regrouping. Now, they don't use this term anymore because the party is so widely discredited after the War of 1812 and at the Hartford Convention that it's really through as a federal force. There's a scattering of people sprinkled in New England and the mid-Atlantic states. I think Delaware is the last state to have a strong Federalist party. So Van Buren comes to Washington determined to kind of revive what he sees as the Jefferson Party, the Jeffersonian Party, and he finds a lot of people in the South who agree with him. Now, they're called the Old Jeffersonians. They're called anti-Federalist. I can't remember. There's so much terminology because they didn't go by one name. The idea was they saw more and more people like Monroe showing some flexibility on this question of internal improvements, the federal role in internal improvements, and many thought these positions were unconstitutional.
Yep.
And Van Buren forms an alliance with a lot of them. Now, their positions are one of really self-interest because their whole philosophy can be summed up in one line, and that was done by Nathaniel Macon, the senator. Was he from Georgia or North Carolina? I'm blanking out, but he was a Southern senator. They all called him Father Macon, and he had this line there when he says, "If Congress can finance the building of canals, they can, with greater authority, emancipate slaves." And this was something John Quincy Adams talked about.
Slavery, yeah.
His idea was once you start giving Congress too many powers to do things not specifically enumerated in the Constitution, it's only a matter of time before they start going after slavery. So they want to start hunkering down early on this, just to form a new party that fights the idea of federal power. Now, Van Buren's position is different because he's from a state that had largely abolished slavery by then. It was not officially abolished until 1827. And even then, there were a few who still fell under a very unfortunate loophole. There was still some slavery in New York until the 1840s. But New York was, by and large, a free state with Van Buren. And his state is overwhelmingly against slavery. He knows this. So he's got to form these coalitions delicately. See, this is a period of forming partnerships of a very, very delicate nature because he's realizing that many constituents back home are not going to like this. So I know I've thrown a lot out there right now, but this was a very, I hate to say complicated because it's really, it requires some thinking, but when you get down to it, it's pretty straightforward about what was going on right now. It's just that there was so many coalitions right now because we were already a growing, expanding nation at this stage that it made the political world to be a strange one indeed.
Yeah, can I work with you? Can I work with you? Is this a deal breaker or not? Everyone's filling that out. I'm curious, before we go too much further down the national rabbit hole, which I definitely want to spend time in, you talked about how he took over New York politics.
Right.
Love to talk, and you talk about how he took some of the learnings from that experience to national. So let's talk about what happened in New York. He builds a political machine called the Albany Regency. He develops this reputation as a magician or a red fox. What was he doing that was so different from everyone else? Like what was his secret sauce for success in New York?
Well, he was a lawyer. That's how he got his training as a lawyer, and he was a very successful lawyer. He was not a New York City lawyer. He lived in New York very briefly, but he was an Albany man. And he was from this region, a little bit south of Albany, Columbia County, where I happen to live, coincidentally.
Hey.
And, right. Columbia County was the site of many of these powerful families that I mentioned, specifically the Van Rensselaers and the Livingstons. These were families that had a broad reach in New York politics. So he gets not only a legal education, but a political education. And early on in his career, he is a successful attorney in Columbia County. And somewhere along the line, DeWitt Clinton brings him into his orbit. Now, DeWitt Clinton is the kingmaker of New York politics in 1810, let's say, right now. There have been Aaron Burr. Of course, Alexander Hamilton dies in the duel in 1804. Aaron Burr is disgraced and exiled. John Jay at this stage is retired and off to his farm. So New York is going through this period, and DeWitt Clinton emerges as the great political force in New York politics, but he's a New York City guy. He needs someone to represent his interests in the Columbia County area. He brings Martin Van Buren into his world, helps him get elected to the state senate in 1812.
Yeah.
This is a key year, 1812.
Yes.
The war with Great Britain breaks out. On top of all that, DeWitt Clinton challenges James Madison for the presidency in 1812. This was an incredibly divisive and controversial move on Clinton's part. Many in New York felt that this was the wrong time for him to be running for president, because he was still fairly young at that stage in his life. I think he's in his early 40s. So Clinton runs for president. So people are feeling like he's challenging a popular incumbent president during wartime, but nevertheless, many of them felt obliged to stick with him because he was the head of the party. And Van Buren helps Clinton. He helps him enormously. And in the 1812 presidential election, when all the electoral votes were decided by the legislature, he finds a way through his skills as a negotiator, his skills as a manager and a tactician, and just through extraordinary confidence and audacity. See, that's something we don't really talk about very much when we look at powerful politicians, but that's really the thing with Van Buren, the key to success. Just great, great confidence in himself. And he had the audacity, which I want to point out, on his first day on the job, he manages to get all of New York to get behind a slate of tickets. So all the state's electoral votes go to DeWitt Clinton, not to James Madison in 1812. Clinton nearly wins that race. If Clinton wins Pennsylvania, he would have won the election. If you look at the map, it just looks like Clinton wins a couple of Northeast states and that's it. But I'll say it again. If only Pennsylvania had voted for him, he would have won by one electoral vote.
Ooh.
So Van Buren's stock, his star, really rises, and it rises rapidly. And at the same time, Clinton's is sinking because many are put off by what happens in the War of 1812. And not only he challenges Madison, but he remains a critic of the war. Van Buren, on the other hand, is a real war hawk, and he gets very involved as a state senator in passing legislation, just getting involved in all kinds of minutiae in the war effort, because New York is really at the center of it. It's a state bordering British Canada. There were many battles taking place in New York. The state was hit very hard. And at the same time, he has this falling out with DeWitt Clinton. It's a falling out that arises over a few misunderstandings, personal differences. DeWitt Clinton is an intensely dislikable person. No, he really, really was. I mean, when you read about how his friends turned on him and turned on him viciously.
Yeah.
You can only conclude from all of this, and they said this as much in their letters and in their writings, how disagreeable he was, what a difficult personality he was, bossy, didactic, heavy-handed, arrogant, intimidating, because he comes from this powerful family, privileged background,
Mm-hmm.
graduates first in his class from Columbia, and he
Mm.
was somebody who wore his learning on his sleeve. He
Yeah.
would quote, the classics, and he would make references to ancient civilizations when he was talking about New York. And these are just simple farmers or, artisans like that who are new in the legislature seeing what's this guy talking about. So DeWitt Clinton really put everybody off. Meanwhile, Martin Van Buren is the opposite in every way.
Yeah.
Likable, pleasant, affable.
Yeah.
If you said something he didn't agree with, he would just nod and say, "That's very interesting." Whereas
The son of an innkeeper. Yeah, very relatable.
DeWitt Clinton would say, "That's the dumbest thing I've ever heard." That's the difference. So Clinton kind of represented the 18th century patrician, old school.
Yeah.
He identified as a Republican, but his manner and his bearing was much more of a Federalist, even though his policies were not in line with the Federalist Party. But he saw a more expansive role for government. And what was the biggest example of this? The Erie Canal.
There you go.
So the Erie Canal, on the one hand, hurts his political career because everyone thinks it's a crazy idea. And I mean everybody. No one thinks, how are we going to build a canal linking the Hudson River to Lake Erie, going all across New York State?
Yeah.
With what, some shovels and some explosives and maybe some donkeys to rip trees out. I mean, that's how they did it. They didn't have machinery back then.
Yeah.
So, but Clinton never gives up on this dream that this is something that can be done. So after the War of 1812, he loses his position as mayor of New York. It looks like his political career is over. And then he comes roaring back in 1817 on the heels of the Erie Canal, when we start to see the first legislation passed, and we start to see more and more petitions coming in from merchants and towns and cities all along western New York, because they're thinking this could really rejuvenate our area by having a canal. We can transport goods back and forth. The biggest canal in America was something like 30 miles, and it was in Massachusetts, and it was largely a financial boondoggle. So no one thought we could pull off something of this scale, which was 360 miles.
Yeah.
But Clinton does. So this, of course, is the great success of his life.
And the Erie Canal is one of the great engineering marvels of early America.
Certainly. I mean, it was the biggest canal in the world.
Yeah.
Nothing compared to it. Yeah.
Okay, so Martin Van Buren picks the right sides of some issues, picks the right enemies with Clinton, and this leads to him becoming a very powerful politician in New York.
Yeah.
And then he goes to create that national party, as you were saying. So what is he taking as a learning from his New York experience that he's applying to the national stage? What's he doing that's new? How is he going about creating this national party to build on what you were saying before of he's trying to figure out who are my allies? Is it this guy in the South? Who do I work with?
Yeah. Well, the first thing is he's thinking about who the next president is going to be. He goes to Washington.
Yeah.
And even though James Monroe...
He's elected senator now. He goes to Washington as a senator.
Goes to Washington as a senator. And we're in the first year of Monroe's second term.
Okay.
I've already said he's practically elected unanimously. Yeah.
Right.
And right away, everyone's talking about 1824. So we think now, the moment that a presidential election ends, we're talking about the next one. This goes back a long ways. 1821.
Yeah.
And there were 17 people who were interested in the job.
Yep.
And a good chunk of them were in James Monroe's cabinet. We don't think of the cabinet anymore as a breeding ground for presidential candidates, but they were back then. So we've got Henry Clay, we have got John Quincy Adams, we have got William Crawford, we have got John C. Calhoun. These are all most of these guys are in Monroe's cabinet.
Yeah.
And even the smaller ones, like Smith Thompson, who was Secretary of the Navy, he wanted to run for president. So there was a lot of people out there vying for this job because this was really the first open seat in American history. Every previous election, there was some Virginian, waiting in the wings, ready to step in. Usually, someone who was Secretary of State. So, 1824 comes around, and it's a wide open race. But again, there's no real secure party system in Washington. Everybody calls himself a Republican. I mean, it had been the term had been overused to the point where it didn't mean anything anymore. When you
I'm an American at this point.
Well, you could get John Quincy Adams, and John C. Calhoun both running for president as a Republican. I mean, could you find two people more different? No.
For sure, yeah.
Right. So this is where Van Buren makes one of the real fateful errors of his early political career. He gets behind William Crawford. Now, to him, Crawford is exactly the kind of politician he likes. Someone with a lot of experience, somebody who spent a long time in presidential cabinets, and he was someone who he sees as someone who could kind of rejuvenate that kind of Jeffersonian spirit that has been lost with the likes of Monroe, and they were all calling the amalgamationist party, the fusion party, the idea of trying to bring everyone together under one umbrella to the point where parties were so diffused they weren't even really a factor in politics anymore. So he sees Crawford as somebody who could light that spark that he thinks is needed on the federal level. The problem is no one in New York feels the same way. And this issue of New York playing second fiddle to the South was already a touchy subject in 1816. I remember I read one great editorial, I think it was the Albany Register newspaper, where someone said, "What is it about Virginia that makes it fertile to produce such great leaders and the rest of the nation is so barren?" I like that line because that really summed up the sentiment. Like, this is a big country. New York has been growing exponentially in terms of population, the financial center, industrial center, and Wall Street is replacing Philadelphia's Chestnut Street as kind of the center of finance and commerce in America. And yet, New Yorkers feel like they are always getting the number 2 job, not the number 1. Because who were the previous vice presidents? Daniel Tompkins, George Clinton, Aaron Burr. What do they all have in common? They're all from New York. And Tompkins wanted to be president, but he had to settle for second place when he fell short. So the backlash against this is so enormous that DeWitt Clinton, who was run out of office in 1822 because he was so unpopular for his heavy-handed and imperious style of governing, comes roaring back to power. He's elected governor again. I know, it's an extraordinary. The man just keeps rising from the dead, like something out of a monster movie. They think they put that knife through the heart and he would emerge again. It really is something else. See, that's the thing about politics, is that things changed, and they changed rapidly.
Sure, yeah.
It really did. That you would have a party routed in one year, and then the next year, forget the next cycle, because assembly races were held every year. They would come roaring back, and this happened all the time. So it was a period of great change and great rapid change, and it was very hard to keep up with it. And Van Buren couldn't keep up with it. So there was this system called the caucus. The caucus is where Congress would decide who would represent the party to run for president. Now, it worked perfectly fine when you had Republicans versus Federalists. Again, what do you do when you have all of these people running?
All the same party now.
Yeah. There's a wide boycott. Not that many people show up, only 62 votes. William Crawford is given the nomination, but no one takes this seriously. So you've got a wide open race. Calhoun drops out because he realizes his support is only limited to his little corner of South Carolina, and he figures, I'm 40 years old, I'll get to run again some other time. So he steps aside, 4-man race. Andrew Jackson, Henry Clay, John Quincy Adams, and Crawford. So we got John Quincy Adams, New England. We've got Crawford, Deep South. We got Jackson from Tennessee, South, parts of the West. Henry Clay of Kentucky, we got the West. Obviously, no one's going to get a majority of the electoral votes, and no one does. Goes to the House of Representatives. John Quincy Adams, even though he did not receive the most popular votes and did not receive the most electoral votes, is elected president. And this is one of the great sort of political earthquakes at that time and in this whole part of American history, because the fallout from this is so terrific that when John Quincy Adams names Henry Clay his Secretary of State, everyone said, well, Clay bargained for these votes. They all called it a corrupt bargain.
Because Clay influenced the House to select him, because House was the tiebreaker.
Right, even though it was such a no-brainer for Clay. He wasn't going to endorse
They were aligned politically.
John Quincy Adams was, even though they didn't always quite get along, they fought a lot at Ghent when they were both negotiating the end to the War of 1812. They both respected each other's abilities.
Yep.
And obviously, in terms of their political philosophies, they were much more in line. Clay, of course, was a big proponent of the American system, the idea of federal government.
Federal investments.
Investments in roads, bridges, canals, and of course, and using federal revenues to do this. And John Quincy Adams was fully on board with this. So they were much more in line ideologically and politically. But nevertheless, there was tremendous controversy over the way this election was settled. And Van Buren uses that to really say, okay, now's the time to build a powerful political party. And he said, you know what? I got Andrew Jackson wrong. I supported Crawford, but now I can see that Jackson has a powerful hold on the American imagination. You have to go back to George Washington to see somebody who is this much admired and who is seen as a sort of figure who could not only win elections, but be the face of a Republican Party that has the kind of that Washington appeal as a military hero that could espouse the political viewpoints of Jefferson. So that's how Van Buren tries to remake him for the American people. And that's what sets the stage for the great election of 1828.
And I just want to ask, if I remember right, didn't Crawford also have like a stroke or something like that?
He did have a stroke. You know, I was trying to find a seamless way of throwing that in there, and I couldn't.
And was he was like still a candidate? Like Van Buren was still kind of behind him?
I think it was October of 1823 where he has this stroke, and it's a severe stroke.
Right.
And Van Buren is writing letters to people, including Thomas Jefferson, I'll point out, where he's basically lying. He's basically saying he's fine.
He's fine.
He was, a little blow there, but he's recuperating, and he's walking, and he's talking, and I spoke to him the other day, and he sounds great, when in fact he was in terrible shape, and he was in no condition to run the country.
Yeah.
So they go along with this because they say, we've come this far, we can't abandon him now, and they were hoping, fingers crossed, that he was going to recuperate, and he did eventually. He never quite regained his previous form.
Right.
It was a severe stroke, but he was trying to promote for the presidency someone who was really incapacitated.
Which is another reason to start looking for someone else. Okay, my first guy had a stroke.
Yes.
Maybe Andrew Jackson. Now, Andrew Jackson was a polarizing guy. I mean,
even back then,
Even back then. You mentioned like one of the reasons Clay and John Quincy got along. They both hated Jackson. Neither of them were going to partner with that.
It was not just them though. Thomas Jefferson didn't like him. James Madison didn't like him, and a lot of the people who were part of his base didn't like him. There was this idea that he's too much of a military man. That Washington was a separate case because of the revolution and what a central role he played. But with Jackson, they looked at his conduct in the First Seminole War, and a lot of people looked at him and saw him as unhinged. They saw him as just too much of an extreme military man. And then there was the question of his politics. A lot of people weren't sure where he stood on political issues, and it was unacceptable to them to just say, well, he won the Battle of New Orleans. That's good enough for us. Oh, no, it's not good enough for us. Where does he stand? Because he was in the United States Senate in the early 1820s,
Right. Right. Yeah.
and he was asked about the tariff and where he stood, and he said, "Well, I'm in favor of a judicial tariff and judicious tariff." And Henry Clay scoffed and said, "Well, I'm in favor of an unjudicious tariff." It was like, who's not in favor of a judicious tariff? So
Right.
they saw him as a little bit of an empty suit, and he did vote for some federal appropriations for improvements in some roads. So they weren't sure that he was their guy. They didn't trust his politics. They didn't trust his temperament. So Van Buren had a lot of convincing to do.
Exactly. So how did
Yeah.
Van Buren overcome that? How does he build a party that you take a guy that certainly has a cult of personality? There are people who loved him. There are people who hated him. High risk, high reward partner there. How
Yeah.
did Van Buren partner with him and make it work to build
Well,
the
again, you go
Democratic
back to what he did in 1812 for DeWitt Clinton. He
Party?
was just really good at being convincing and making a persuasive case. This goes back to his training as a lawyer. He'd go to them and say, "Hey, look, you like the incumbent? No, you don't like the incumbent. So who's your alternative? Because there's only one, and his name is Andrew Jackson. And whether you like it or not, the American people love him."
Mm.
And I think it's Van Buren saying, I'm talking to Van Buren, he would
Right.
say, I think too much exposure to the military life made him this way.
Huh.
He briefly served in the House and in the Senate in the
Yeah.
1790s, and he kind of said, I think we can push him back to kind of those old Jeffersonian roots of his.
Yeah.
As long as we kind of bring him into the fold and try to talk with him and kind of coach him on positions and things like that. So there was very much kind of the molding of a
Mhm.
presidential candidate for the first time really in American history, and Van Buren was the central figure in this.
So Van Buren, he uses all these things just said to build a Democratic Party. And the Democratic Party that he builds is the party that has lasted longer than all the others. The Whigs will die, the Know Nothings will die, the Federalists will die. What is it about this party that he made that gave it such strength to endure where so many others fell away, especially in that time period?
I think it's all of these things we've been talking about. And this was something he worried about, that a party will not last long if it's not going to be a party that's got the full backing of the people. Now, no party can get the backing of everybody, of course,
Right.
but if there's a party that can draw significant parts of the electorate, it will endure. And the way to do this was to make campaigns, events, to get communities energized and involved, to get people energized and involved. And this is something you had to break down, not federal, state, local. The way to do that, give out jobs. Great way to cement someone's loyalty. You get a good job with security that pays decently, and that person goes back to his neighborhood or his town and promotes our candidate, whether it's going to be at a stump rally or any kind of event of any kind. That's a way of ensuring that it's going to have some sort of longevity. So I think it's all of these traits that we now associate with political parties, from the convention to
Yeah.
the stump speaking to
Yeah.
the campaigning. All of that was a way of making parties more of a permanent role in American life, as opposed to making them much more of a passive role in American life, which is what they were in the 1790s and early 19th century.
How did the creation of the Democratic Party change the way politics worked in Washington? And for example, how well was the party able to control its members the way parties do or fail to do today? You often see party line, were there party line votes back then? Was it Martin Van Buren in the back, issuing, this is where we stand on this issue? How did it change the way things worked in Washington?
Uh, I know this is a long pause because I'm thinking, Kenny, because you
Absolutely.
asked me a very deep question.
Yeah.
A few things. One is they were electing people who were much more dogmatic and more really in line with the party. So by doing that, you kind of had that loyalty in the Congress and in the Senate. So that was a bit of a change of pace. But I have to say, and this is something I think doesn't get written about enough,
Yeah.
that the party system, even though it was taking hold in American life, was still not nearly as cohesive as it is today.
Mm-hmm.
You had Democrats who were pro-slavery and anti-slavery. You
Mm-hmm.
had Whigs who were pro-slavery and anti-slavery. There was wide variety of positions that people within parties took. They all generally supported the same candidates for president, and especially once you had the conventions and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
But the sort of cohesion you see today, where you get the Susan Collins or the Lisa Murkowski
Yeah.
not voting for cabinet pick, it's big, big news because you
Right.
expect every
Right.
Republican to go along.
Yeah.
That was not the case back then at all. You really had these renegades, and you would have this, throughout the 20th century. You think about Democratic coalition had the deep, deep South. All those rabid segregationists, they were all Democrats. But then you would have the urban laborers in the North. So it took a while, really, for parties to become, to have this level of discipline. They didn't quite have it back then, but they had some. It was the beginnings, and much more than what you had in the early republic.
Yeah.
So still, by having a party, and especially things changed when presidential elections, you had the conventions, platforms, committees, that really changed a lot because then a party could just say, you want to know what we stand for? Go to your newspaper because our platform is going to be right there. And that platform was really supposed to define what people, what candidates stood. And they were obliged to follow it, and many of them did. Sometimes we hear about these platforms now, we kind of roll our eyes reading them, knowing that's not going to happen once they go to office. But they kind of did in the 1830s and 40s and even 50s.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
This is kind of one of those questions. There's no way to really know for sure. But what do you think? If Van Buren could see the two-party system we have today, do you think he would say
the zombie apocalypse question? I call this.
Right. He's back, just like DeWitt Clinton kept coming back. He's back.
He's
would
back.
He say, yes, this is just as I planned. It's working perfectly. Or would he say, you fools bungled it all up. This isn't how it was supposed to work. What do you think he'd make of today's
Okay, great question. He would like many parts of our political life. He would love the fact that we've got the political party playing such a profound role in America's political life. This is exactly how we wanted it. You've got television stations, you've got websites, you've got blogs, you've still got newspapers who are still kind of towing the party line and still kind of promoting the interests of the party. All of these he saw as good things. He saw partisanship as a good thing. Nevertheless, he would expect members of the Senate. The House was where people were supposed to fight. The House is where things were supposed to get heated. But the Senate is where the grown-ups were supposed to come in and sit down in the smoke-filled room and settle things.
Yeah.
And we don't get that anymore. And that is something he would be very, very much against. Another thing he would be very much against is the role of money in our political system and in our political party. He is the first president to ever make an endorsement. My colleague at the Van Buren papers, Andrew Wiley, found this in his research. Late 1850s, I think it was, Martin Van Buren endorsed cow manure fertilizer for farming. We think this was the first presidential endorsement. So we got a president endorsing cow manure. So you could imagine the field day a psychiatrist would have with that.
That's fantastic. What is the
but the role of money in elections, politicians leaving office, going to work for powerful law firm, lobbying on behalf of the interests they used to represent. That was frowned upon back then, so he would very much frown upon that. and I don't think he would care for the incumbent president very much. And that's all I'll say on that subject.
What is the lasting impact and legacy that Van Buren left on the presidency, on American politics?
Well, the presidency, I would say, it's not so much his presidency,
Yeah.
which was an unhappy,
Right.
misery-filled 4 years. There were a few successes, but mostly it was an unhappy presidency. It really comes down to Andrew Jackson, that he played such a formative role in kind of building up his image, and Jackson used that popularity to build a powerful presidency that kind of set the standard for many others who became president, who kind of looked at Andrew Jackson as a model. So that was his biggest impact there. Otherwise, I would just say everything we've been discussing,
Yeah.
the party. The fact that political parties are now inseparable from politics in America. That if someone knocks on your door around election time, and let's say he's running for town supervisor, and it's a non-political office, you might be still wondering in the back of your mind,
Right.
is this guy a Republican or a Democrat? Come
Yep.
on, fella, who are you with? You may want to know that. The fact that we think this way right now shows how political we are and how much we associate parties with how politics is practiced in America.
What lessons in leadership do you think we can learn from Van Buren?
Well, I liked writing about his presidency. There was something charming and even a bit poignant about it. He comes into office in 1837,
Yeah.
and he says in his inaugural address, "I know full well you're all here to say goodbye to Andrew Jackson, and you're not saying hello to me." I'm paraphrasing, but I'm not far off by much. He says, "I know you're all here to say goodbye to Jackson. That's okay. But I'm here to say we've reached the stage where you don't need a powerful government, federal government. The states, you can all run your own lives. You can all, your own legislatures can govern in ways we can't do here in Washington." So there was something really poignant in that to me, I thought. Just the fact that he really thought that he could lead this way, and what happens weeks into his administration? The economy collapses. It collapses. And then there are these skirmishes in northern New York and the Canadian border. And then there's the issue of Texas wanting to become part of the Union.
Of course.
And then there is, it was completely untenable and completely unworkable. And everyone's looking for him to intervene in ways he doesn't really think is inappropriate. And he probably couldn't have done much anyway in the 1830s to revive the American economy. But nations need representatives. They need people to use their power and to use their influence to promote the public good. I think that's something that his presidency proved, and I think that's the lesson that this issue of what's that balance between the federal and the state government. What are the roles they're supposed to be? When does the state do things better? When does the federal government do things better? These were things they were arguing about in the Constitutional Convention. I don't think we're ever going to have one formula we all agree upon. But I do think this idea that Washington can just remain aloof from the affairs of state is not tenable at all. And this was the lesson of Van Buren's presidency.
Yeah.
It couldn't be done. So here we've got renewed debates about what these roles should be. They're always going to be around, but they'll just take different forms. And I think they'll be over different issues, but they're always going to be part of our lives. So I hope in this book I wrote, people will see what were the issues they were debating in the 1830s and 40s.
If you've enjoyed this interview with James and want to learn more about Martin Van Buren, please pick up that book, Martin Van Buren, America's First Politician, from your favorite bookstore. You can also find more of James's research at vanburenpapers.org. Thank you for your time, James.
Thank you, Kenny. I had a lot of fun.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of Abridged Presidential Histories. If you enjoyed it, please subscribe, tell your friends and family about the show, and write a 5-star review on your podcast listening platform of choice. If you'd like to support the show, you can look it up on Patreon or go directly to www.patreon.com/abridgedpresidentialhistories. This helps me buy books and pay to host the show, and thank you so much to everyone who's contributed so far. The music in today's podcast is a public domain recording of the United States Army Old Guard Fife and Drum Corps. In our next episode, let's cover that first Trump administration, protests, tax cuts, travel bans, impeachment, insurrection, another impeachment, COVID. How did a thrice married New York real estate developer who donated to Democrats become a Republican president anyway? That's coming up next time on Abridged Presidential Histories.